Next up, I'd like to introduce Ray Ison. Ray is Professor of Systems at the Open University. His research and scholarship spans the biophysical and social and is primarily interdisciplinary and collaborative. Ray is currently involved in managing and presenting the postgraduate program in Systems Thinking in Practice, and Ray also contributes to the activities of the Applied Systems Thinking in Practice group. I hand you over to Ray. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to give this talk. If I can get this to click over. I think it's rather fitting that we're here in Germany having this conversation. I'm not sure how many of you know about Alexander von Humboldt, but I regard him as one of the greatest systems thinkers. He was a very prescient polymath who foresaw the rise of the Anthropocene in his travels in Venezuela in 1799, when he said the destructions of forests and of humankind's long-term changes to the environment, including ruthless irrigation and the great mass of steam and gases produced in industrial centers, was destroying the environment. A question we could ask ourselves is what happened to the understandings that von Humboldt and his milieu generated in the early part of the 19th century. The Western intellectual tradition seems to me to have forgotten it, and perhaps the purpose of this event is to recapture that legacy and to rebuild it quickly. Dave, in his opening words about this conference, said, this is a quote from what he said and wrote, so I'd ask you to just look at this and ask yourself the question, do I agree with him? Are there issues there that things there that I could take issue? Do I regard myself as a systems thinker? So hold those sort of questions with you as my talk goes on, because my talk is organized as a systemic inquiry into 4 questions, but also a 5th, which is to take these questions away with you or to join me in conversation afterwards and to pursue them. So it's easy to agree with Dave's claims, I find, but what do they mean in terms of praxis, our own purposeful, theory-informed practical action? What is it that we do when we do what we do? Particularly when, to meet the challenges of sustainability, we express a wish to transform systems or employ a systems perspective or systems thinking. And I think this is a very germane set of questions to the organizing question of today. So, to my first inquiry question, what do we do when we do what we do? Well, before going on, let's ask the question, what did Donella Meadows do when she did what she did? This is a quote where she describes what she did. So one day I was sitting in a meeting about the new global trade regime, NAFTA and GATT, and the World Trade Organization. The more I listened, the more I began to simmer inside. This is a huge new system people are inventing, I said to myself. They haven't the slightest idea how it will behave. Myself said back to me, it's cranking the system in the wrong direction. Growth at any price. And the control measures these nice folks are talking about, small parameter adjustments, negative feedback loops, are puny. And she then jumped up in the meeting and proceeded to write her 9 points as it was then. So ask yourself, as we go on, and I'm going to return to this, what did Donella Meadows do when she did what she did? So, I want to make the claim based on, I think, sound understandings from all sorts of domains of research and science, that all practice is situated and embodied, and that we can make the following set of claims. All observations require an observer. Everything said is said by someone, and that we as a species live in language. All knowing is doing. All being, knowing, and doing is relational. And all observers, practitioners, actors have a history, a tradition of understanding out of which we think and act. So, to perhaps just unpack this, walking is a practice. So I often ask, when I've got more time, for people to respond to this question about how does walking arise as a practice? If you put this hook under our collar and I keep moving my legs, then walking as a practice doesn't happen. So walking as a practice happens in the relational dynamics between two entities, which we could call systems if you like, me as a body with an evolutionary past, and a medium, the floor. You break the relational dynamics between the two, and walking as a practice doesn't happen. Now, we can talk about the structural coupling of social and biophysical systems as having the same relational dynamics as walking. It's what Umberto Maturana calls an isophore, relational dynamics in one domain being the same in another domain. And so if we take walking, then we can imagine that walking involves me as part of a social system, a medium, the floor as part of a biophysical system, and the quality of our walking mediated by the shoes we wear, the institutions, social technologies, rules of the game, etc., that we humans invent, technologies, etc. Now let's take this idea of relational thinking into understanding practice. Remembering that all practice is situated, but if we abstract ourselves for the moment out of the situation and reflect or engage in reflexive practice, we can see that all practice requires a practitioner who has a tradition of understanding out of which they think and act. They choose, knowingly or not, a framework of ideas, and they have agency to frame the situations that they engage with. We usually engage in some methodology, technique, tools, etc., to explore the situation. And so there's a great possibility for learning and feedback processes to operate if we understand practice in these ways. We can learn about our frameworks, our framings, our methods, about the situation, and about our practice. New knowing, or after reification, knowledge. Innovation, change, understanding about the situation. Insights into practitioner traditions of understanding through reflexivity. And learning about overall practice performance, the performativity of our practice. And changing social relations with others, remembering that all practice is relational. All practice as well is mediated by technology or social technology, including theories and models, or institutions in the economic sense of rules of the human game. And so these are part of a mediating repertoire. They don't exist in and of themselves. They mediate practice. And so how do we bring these to particular situations of concern? We can have a very rich situation of concern, but we tend to, as Nikki has just said, we tend to organize our engagement with these situations through disciplinary lens or single perspective framings. And so it raises questions about how different traditions of understanding, frameworks, methods, choices, and assumptions influence the way we engage with situations and novel situations. So, question 2. What do we do when we seek to transform situations? So, framing situations is a choice we have and one we always make. As George Lakoff says, all thinking and talking involves framing, and since frames come in systems, a single word typically activates not only its defining frame, but also much of the system its defining frame is in. So much of what we're talking about today has behind it particular framing choices and entailments. I might add that reality itself is a framing choice. So framing choices create initial starting conditions that become conserved as lineages or pathway dependencies and as institutions, norms, rules of the human game. We often don't know what framing choices have become institutionalized because they've come taken for granted assumptions. I want to just draw on a project I led in 2000-2004 called SLIM, Social Learning for the Integrated Management and Sustainable Use of Water at Catchment Scale, to point out some of the implications of framing choices. We started that project by framing sustainability of the river systems not as a property of the biophysical river, but as an emergent property of social processes. And we framed these situations as being characterized by interdependencies, complexity, uncertainty, controversy, and multiple stakeholding or perspectives. And we were not entirely new in this because many systems scholars of the past have similarly encountered such situations and chosen to frame them in certain ways. Hassan Ozbekian, when he developed the precursor report to the Club of Rome that led to the Limits to Growth study, talked about the global problematique. Russ Ackoff talked about messes and difficulties. Rittel and Weber talked about wicked and tame problems. And Donald Schoen talked about the real-life swamp and high ground of technical rationality. Unfortunately, what were essentially framing choices for their experiences have become categories of problems. And so we have diminished the action and the agency we have in making framing choices. One of the dominant framing choices around all that we've been talking about here thus far is how problems come into existence and who participates in the naming of problems. The dominant governance mechanism in environmental circles is that there is a fixed form of knowledge, a problem can be named, it's stationary for a period of time, and you can bring in governance mechanisms, market mechanisms, etc., to do something about it. But we know in the Anthropocene that stationarity is dead. And so the alternative is how knowing occurs within the act of constructing an issue through social learning. And of course, the key question is who participates in the knowing process and how the issue gets constructed and how, over time, concerted action can emerge. And this offers then an alternative governance mechanism to that which predominates still. But we can also frame situations as systems. And some of these framings have become institutionalized as things like ecosystems. Tansley, when he coined the term ecosystem, said we need a term, a mental isolate to enable us to do our work, he said to ecologists. But from a mental isolate, these have become reified into things in the world which we map, study, etc., etc. And we've developed various forms of practice or descriptions of practice where the noun systems is rather ambiguous. So I claim in my work that the word system has gone feral, and the noun system conceals the praxis dimension that is essential if one is going to engage in systems thinking. Now, its feral nature is, I think, an opportunity, and the invitation I'd extend to you is to how you go home and take advantage of its feral nature to make it do work more effectively than what you currently do. Now, we can deploy the adjectives, as I will show in a minute, that come from the word system, systematic and systemic. And we can build noun compounds that take a verb form, which we do in our program, Systems Thinking in Practice. So, what do we do when we design experiences using the concept system, seeking the emergence of transformation? I'm going to draw on our experiences at the Open University to address this question. For those of you who don't know anything about the Open University in the UK, it's a very large organisation, 160,000 part-time students. We've been teaching systems at the university since 1972. Probably 50,000 students or more have studied some systems at some time. And producing a course or a module, as we now call it, involves investment of somewhere between £250,000 and £1 million. So it's very different to your face-to-face teaching situations that you've encountered. Now, the first course that was ever produced in our organisation was called Systems Behaviour in 1972. It attracted thousands of students who studied it. Our main program at the moment is a suite of postgraduate courses with different awards in systems thinking in practice, for which we've produced a set of co-published books and which will be renewed in the coming year. The other aspect of our own praxis is important. We don't differentiate between teaching and research as a dualism. We see ourselves engaged in systemic inquiry and action research in all that we do. So we see our praxis as in terms of walking the talk of what our courses are about. And we have a series of ongoing research programs, small research programs, which elucidate key questions like how to enhance systems thinking in the workplace, designing for professional practice, how do we professionalize this sort of practice, and transforming postgraduate praxis with employers and in the workplace. I've been working with employers in the UK under their new apprenticeship scheme to create what's called a master's level apprenticeship for systems thinking. So that's one of my current activities. Now, what have we learned from 50 years nearly of systems educating? Well, we have a rule of thumb. About 1/3 of our students arrive with what I'll call a strongly held systemic sensibility. Discovering systems thinking through formal study offers solace and gives credibility to the way they intuitively understand the world. For many, it's a great relief to understand that there's actually a language and concepts to describe their experience. For another third, study of systems creates what we call aha moments. The realization that you can think about your own thinking and act to change it. And for yet another third, it generates a personal precipice, a threat to identity, which often they're not prepared to step over in the period that they're with us in the study. And fear undoubtedly plays a part in this. So in all that we do now, we use this heuristic to think about our education and our pedagogy. The relational dynamics of our students with the biosphere is a central concern. That relationship is mediated by the technosphere, and we need to understand how the technosphere operates and mediates. Systemic sensibilities need to be recovered or enhanced, restored. We need to build systems literacy about the different traditions of understanding in systems. And what's more, we need to go beyond that and to build capability to use these concepts and ideas in action to transform situations for the better. And the argument here about systemic sensibilities that I'm trying to make is that I would claim we humans are born with and into a systemic sensibility, but that we lose it as we encounter the institutions of our particularly Western civilization. I want to talk through one particular module that I've had a lot to do with that's part of this program called Managing Systemic Change, Inquiry, Action and Interactions. This module would be studied by students, mature age students, over 20 weeks of study. And since 2010, when we started this, over 1,000 mature age students have successfully completed this module. Now, in this module design, we're concerned about recovering or reinforcing a systemic sensibility. Now, remembering that all practice is relational, I'm going to ask our person over here to put on the next slide. Whoops, back, can we go back? If you just look at this, Okay, I hope you followed that. So, students are confronted, and we are all confronted with a choice. Do we start with a situation which we engage with through the idea of a system, or do we start with the idea that there is systems out there in the world? Systems as epistemologies or systems as ontologies? This is a choice that exists in the whole field of systems. I don't expect you to even contemplate reading this, but this is a heuristic device designed to talk about the field of systems scholarship. On the right-hand side, there are a whole set of systems scholars and practices and approaches and methods and methodologies which draw on different key influences and thinkers from different strands. And there are many players in this, including Donella Meadows, who's in the right-hand side there, in the middle, but others. And importantly, those towards the top of the grey box have in their practice and their enactment and their theorising a commitment to seeing systems as ontologies, whereas down the bottom, more of those people have a commitment to seeing systems as epistemologies. So there's this tension within the systems field around these issues. And it's important to both understand them and to understand these lineages. While I've got this slide on, let me make the point that nowhere, to my knowledge, in the world is there a program in which you could learn all about this field. And that, I think, is an indictment to universities, to us collectively, that there is nowhere that you can do that. And there are questions of boundaries, does lean and agile come in or other things, what's in the systems tradition, etc. Now, in dealing with the issue of ontology or epistemology, we think it's a fruitless debate to talk in terms of either-or dualisms, where they're self-negating pairs. We rather reframe in terms of dualities, and we would claim that both systemic and systematic thinking are necessary. And that systems practice is made up of both. But we need to treat it as a duality, and we need the ability of students to move up and down the ladder, to move up and down levels of abstraction and understanding between the systematic and the systemic. And importantly, we need to change our priorities, because at the moment, the systematic dominates. The other aspect of our teaching is going back to the idea that all practice is embodying, is we use a particular isophore called about juggling, and arguing that systems practice has the same dynamics as juggling. 4 particular balls: our own being, how we engage with situations, how we contextualize our practices to circumstances, and how we manage our own performance in a particular situation. And we design the students' engagement through an iterative cycle of inquiries, an inquiry into their own systems practice, an inquiry into managing change in their situation of concern, and through time, taking what we call a design turn and taking responsibility for not only developing their practice, but for developing the context of their practice, and ultimately for how they expand their practice into practice with others. I might let you just read this slide. It's unsolicited feedback from a student last year I had after they completed this module of study. Remember, I've not met this student. We've had communications via email and other things of that nature, but in our mode of study, we don't have face-to-face interaction. I can say as an educator, it's very satisfying when you get such emails. And of course, there are others at the other end of the spectrum who feel quite angry and cross, so I have those as well. So, some final reflections. What do we do when we speak the language of transformation and seek to transform? Well, if you look at the etymology of the word transformation, there are 2 essentially meanings of the word, and they are either complementary or competitive, depending on how you choose to do it. One, I think, is a linear conception, which is more in line with a systematic knowledge transfer, linear understandings. And the other is a more of a systemic conception, more akin to the idea of emergence from systems theory, that the properties of a whole are different to the sum of the parts. So we need to understand, when we use the word transformation, how we're going to choose to understand it. So what did Donella Meadows do when she did what she did? And this is my claim, for which I take responsibility. When she intervened in a meeting and first articulated her places to intervene in a system, she was engaged in a form of praxis. Her actions combined, in my view, systemic sensibility, systems literacy, and systems thinking and practice capability. But, and this is perhaps my main point, I don't believe she used the concept system reflexively. So I think there is a danger that renderings of places to intervene are reduced to a praxis that is more systematic than systemic. And this calls, in my view, for greater critical, including epistemological awareness by practitioners who seek to transform to sustainability. We have to take responsibility for our own epistemological commitments. It's not that you have one or the other, but that you know you have one and you take responsibility for it. Understanding of how heuristics work to mediate practice is another thing I think that's important. Now, here's two modes, if you like, of praxis that you could envisage that come from Meadows' places to intervene. There's the Lufana model. The other one is essentially drawing on concepts that come from Techland's soft systems methodology, which is how you build activity models based on verbs about activities. So the higher purpose is be purposeful, do co-design, identify future feedback processes, know key parameters, etc. So that invites then a praxis of doing and designing, and the system is co-created in the process with others. Now, we live in a world, I claim, where systemic sensibility dominates and overcrowds systematic sensibility dominates and systemic sensibility is almost driven out. We've got a limited amount of systems literacy and very little systems thinking and practice capability. And I would claim that we need to move to the other situation where at the core of all that we do is the duality of systematic sensibility with systemic sensibility, an expanded systems literacy, and much, much greater systems thinking and practice capability. So the question is, how do we do that? And I think the essence of this is about how we design and co-design systems, purposeful systems to do this. I think there is an opportunity in recovering our systemic sensibility from the emerging stories about our microbiomes, which are essentially a new understanding about how our cognition works. The gut is just as powerful cognitively as the brain and is a key center for understanding. And the essence of what it means to be a walking ecology in which almost half of your cells are non-human cells, and to be really confronted with your dependence on your interdependencies with others, and that this affects your health and your cognition and intergenerational issues, which this research is showing up, I think challenges the last 50 years of the isolated individual that sits behind Homo economicus. I hope it works or moves. We can also appreciate that what Romans did when they invented their particular god, Janus. They appreciated the duality between the inner and the outer view. It is the constant iteration of two-way traffic between these inner and outer that creates transformative moments. Gregory Bateson called this being open to the difference that makes a difference. Arthur Koestler talked of the consciousness as that special attribute of activity which decreases in direct proportion to habit formation. The condensation of learning into habit is accompanied by the dimming of the lights of awareness, he said. And that was behind my statement yesterday about universities. Universities have become habit-creating organizations, and they create dimness and lack of awareness. With apologies to people who don't feel they're in that boat. But this is my final slide. All of what we're talking about here today is situated in governance systems that we created in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century that underpin the existence of nation states. And it's a relational dynamic between civil society, the state, judiciary, law, private sector, and the media. Now, these were formed pre-multinational companies, pre-recognition that we are the creators of the Anthropocene. So my contention is that our governance systems are no longer capable of doing what they need to do. You can see it everywhere around us, yet we're not talking about it. In work I'm doing, we're proposing that a new conception of a governance system has to have the biosphere as central to it, its conception. It's always been an externality, in my view, and just an add-on. The other thing is we need to take responsibility for the technosphere. There's been a sort of laissez-faire capitalist view of technology, something anyone can do it, and it's not linked to social purpose. The state is no longer fit to be the arbiter of social purpose, and we need new institutions that create, through deliberative mechanisms and institutional devices, a charting of social purpose. Think of the failure of educational policy in most of our nation states, which ought to be at the forefront as the set of practices and institutions that arbitrate and create an ongoing inquiry into social purpose. They've become quite incapable of contributing to that particular discourse and trajectory. And I would claim that unless we invest in capacity of people to be related through all they do to the biosphere, to be aware of the limitations and constraints of the technosphere, to recover their systemic sensibilities, to become more systems literate, and to build their capability to act and practice, then we will not achieve the transformations that are necessary. Thank you.